Welcome to our deep dive into neuroanatomy. It's like opening a brand new neuroanatomy textbook, but instead of being overwhelmed by all those pages and diagrams, you've got us.
Yeah, we're going to be your guides today.
We're going to break down the complexities of the nervous system.
And we're going to do it in a way that's clear and engaging.
And fun, hopefully.
We're going to be using excerpts and diagrams from your vet neuroanatomy textbook.
Oh, very cool.
To help you understand the intricate web that controls everything. From a dog chasing a squirrel to a cat's perfectly timed pounce.
That's really cool. So let's start with the basics. What exactly is the nervous system?
Think of it as your patient's internal communication network. It's responsible for receiving information, processing that information, and then generating responses. It's what allows animals to sense their environment, make decisions, and take action.
Okay, so it's kind of like the main frame of the body.
Yeah, you could think of it that way, okay?
And all that starts with a neuron, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The neuron is the fundamental building block of the nervous system. Each neuron has three main parts: the cell body, dendrites, and an axon. So imagine a dog sniffing a flower. Odor molecules bind to receptors in the dog's nose, triggering a signal in the sensory neurons there.
So those signals travel through the dendrites.
Exactly. Dendrites are like the branching arms of a neuron, reaching out to receive signals from other neurons. They're covered in tiny receptors, each tuned to specific types of signals.
Okay, so the dendrites pick up the signal, and where does it go from there?
It travels down the axon, which is like a long cable that transmits the signal away from the cell body. Think of it as a highway carrying information from one part of the nervous system to another.
Okay, and those axons are covered in myelin, right? I remember that from my way back biology classes.
You're right. Myelin is a fatty substance. It acts as insulation for the axon, speeding up the transmission of signals. It's like the insulation around an electrical wire, preventing the signal from leaking out.
Okay, so we've got neurons sending signals throughout the body. But what about the central nervous system? That's the brain and spinal cord, right?
Exactly. The central nervous system, or CNS, it's the command center of the entire nervous system. It receives information from the body, processes it, and then sends out instructions.
And it's all protected by the meninges and cerebrospinal fluid, right?
Absolutely. The meninges are 3 layers of membranes. They surround the brain and spinal cord, providing protection from physical damage.
It's like a multi-layered security system for the most important part of the body.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And then we have cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, which flows between those layers of meninges. It cushions the brain and spinal cord, providing a buoyant environment. But it also plays a vital role in transporting nutrients and removing waste products.
So it's kind of like the bouncer and the cleaning crew.
That's a good way to think about it.
Okay, cool. Now, if we look at figure 1.1 in the textbook, it shows us the different parts of the brain. Can you walk us through them?
Of course. Let's start with the cerebrum, which is the largest and most prominent part of the brain. It's responsible for higher level functions, like learning, memory, and conscious thought.
So when a dog learns a new trick, that's the cerebrum that's hard at work.
Precisely. And the cerebrum is also responsible for processing sensory information, such as sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch.
Okay, so it's kind of like the brain's main processing center, taking in all the information and figuring out what it means.
Exactly. Now nestled underneath the cerebrum, we have the cerebellum, which is responsible for coordinating movement, balance, and posture.
So if a cat is gracefully leaping from one surface to another, it's the cerebellum that's making sure those movements are smooth.
Absolutely. And finally, we have the brainstem, which connects the brain to the spinal cord. It's responsible for essential life-sustaining functions like breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure.
So even when an animal is sleeping, the brainstem is still working hard.
That's right. It's like the unsung hero of the nervous system, working tirelessly in the background.
Okay. And speaking of connections, let's move on to the spinal cord. What's its role in all of this?
The spinal cord is like the information superhighway of the body, connecting the brain to the peripheral nervous system, which extends throughout the body.
So it's the main communication pathway between the brain and everything else.
Exactly. Sensory information travels up the spinal cord to the brain, and motor commands travel down the spinal cord from the brain, telling muscles what to do.
And if we look at figure 1.2, it shows us how the spinal cord is protected by the vertebrae.
That's right. The spinal cord runs through a canal formed by the vertebrae, providing protection from injury. And it's divided into different segments, each responsible for controlling different parts of the body.
So the cervical segment controls the head and neck. The thoracic segment controls the chest and abdomen and so on.
Precisely. And branching out from each segment are spinal nerves, which carry signals to and from specific areas of the body.
This figure also shows the foramen magnum, which is that opening at the base of the skull, where the spinal cord connects to the brain. That seems like it would be a really vulnerable spot.
It is. Any damage to the foramen magnum could have serious consequences, disrupting the flow of information between the brain and the body.
Wow, okay. And I'm noticing that the spinal cord doesn't extend the full length of the vertebral column.
That's an important observation. Instead, it tapers into a cone-shaped structure called the conus medullaris, and from there, a bundle of nerve roots extends down, resembling a horse's tail, which is why it's called the cauda equina.
Huh. That's cool. So even though the spinal cord itself ends, those nerves continue to travel down.
Exactly.
Wow, it's amazing how it's organized.
It is, and understanding this organization is crucial for vets, because damage to different parts of the spinal cord can lead to very specific neurological deficits.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we've got a good overview of the structure of the central nervous system. Let's talk more about how it actually functions. Like, how does sensory information get from the body to the brain?
That's where sensory pathways come in. Imagine a dog steps on a thorn. Sensory receptors in the dog's paw detect that sharp sensation.
Poor pup.
Right. So that signal, that pain signal, travels along a sensory nerve fiber, entering the spinal cord through what we call the dorsal root.
Okay, so the dorsal root is like the entry point for that information.
Exactly. And if we look at figure 1.3, we can see this pathway illustrated beautifully. Once inside the spinal cord, that signal travels up specific tracks. Think of them as bundles of nerve fibers carrying similar information.
Okay, and those tracks are labeled in figure 1.4, right? Like the spinothalamic tract for pain and temperature, and the dorsal columns for touch and proprioception.
Yes. It's important to be familiar with these major pathways because they can help us understand where a neurological problem might be localized. For example, if a dog loses its sense of proprioception, meaning it's unaware of where its limbs are in space, we might suspect a problem with the dorsal columns.
So understanding these pathways is like having a roadmap to the nervous system.
Precisely. And once that sensory signal reaches the brain, it's processed in the sensory cortex, allowing the animal to consciously perceive the sensation.
So the dog feels the pain of the thorn because of this relay race of signals.
Exactly. And now that we've seen how sensory information travels to the brain, let's talk about how the brain sends commands back out to the muscles, initiating movement. This is where motor pathways come in. So think about it this way. When a dog decides to chase after that squirrel, the command to run originates in the motor cortex of the brain.
Yeah.
And that signal travels down the spinal cord through specific motor tracts, like the corticospinal tract, which we see labeled in figure 1.4.
Right, okay, yeah, I see it.
And just like with sensory pathways, these motor pathways are organized in a very specific way. Damage to different tracts can lead to different clinical signs, which is why understanding this organization is so crucial for veterinary neurology.
It's like a complex network of roads, each pathway leading to a specific destination.
That's a great analogy. And once the signal reaches the appropriate level of the spinal cord, it exits through the ventral root and travels along a motor nerve to reach the target muscle, causing it to contract.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, we have upper motor neurons that originate in the brain and travel down the spinal cord, and then lower motor neurons that directly connect to the muscles.
You got it. And distinguishing between uppy and lower motor neuron problems is a key diagnostic skill for veterinarians.
Oh, for sure. Can you give us an example of how that would play out in like a clinical setting?
Absolutely. Let's say you have a dog coming in with weakness in its hind limbs. If the problem is with the upper motor neurons, you might see signs like spasticity, increased reflexes, and a stiff gait. But if the problem is with the lower motor neurons, you might see muscle atrophy, decreased reflexes, and a more flaccid type of weakness.
So those subtle differences can really help you figure out where the problem is.
Exactly. It's like putting together a puzzle, using the clinical signs as clues to figure out where the damage is.
This all makes so much more sense now that we're looking at these diagrams and seeing how everything connects and communicates. There's still one thing I'm curious about, though. Why are there different colors of tissue in the brain and spinal cord? What's the difference between gray matter and white matter?
That's a great question. It all comes down to the types of cells that make up these areas. Gray matter is primarily made up of neuron cell bodies, dendrites and synapses, those connections between neurons. Think of it as the processing center of the nervous system.
So gray matter is where all the thinking happens.
Exactly. White matter, on the other hand, gets its color from myelin, that fatty substance that insulates axons. White matter is primarily made up of myelinated axons, which transmit signals between different areas of the nervous system.
So white matter is like the information superhighway.
Precisely.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about reflex arcs. Can you remind us what those are?
A reflex arc is an automatic response to a stimulus. It's a way for the body to react quickly to potential danger without having to involve conscious thought. A great example is the patellar reflex or knee-jerk reflex, which is often tested during a neurological exam.
Oh yeah, the vet taps on the tendon below the kneecap, and the leg kicks out.
Exactly. That tap stretches the tendon, which activates sensory receptors in the muscle. That signal travels along a sensory neuron to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, it synapses directly with a motor neuron, which sends a signal back down to the muscle, causing it to contract, producing that knee jerk.
And all of that happens without the brain even being involved.
That's right. It's a completely involuntary response, happening at the level of the spinal cord. But by testing reflexes, we can gain valuable information about the integrity of the nervous system.
So if a reflex is absent or exaggerated, it could be a sign that something's not quite right.
Exactly. It's like a little window into the health of the nervous system.
This is really fascinating stuff. It's just amazing to think that all of these complex processes are happening constantly inside our patients.
It is incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like a hidden world.
And the more we learn about the nervous system, the better equipped we'll be as vets to diagnose and treat neurological problems in animals.
For sure, for sure. So for all of our listeners out there who are going to be future vets, what are some key takeaways from this deep dive that you want them to remember?
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that neuroanatomy isn't just about memorizing terms and diagrams.
Right.
It's about understanding how the nervous system works.
Being able to apply it.
Exactly. So you can use that knowledge in real-world clinical situations.
Like recognizing the difference between upper and lower motor neuron signs.
Exactly. Or being able to use your knowledge of sensory pathways to figure out where a problem might be.
It's like being a detective.
Yes.
Solving these neurological mysteries.
And I also want to encourage everyone to visualize, to really picture those textbook diagrams when you're examining your patients.
Because it can really help to make it all make more sense.
It can. Like, for example, when you're performing a neurological exam, picture those sensory pathways carrying information from the animal's body to the brain, and then those motor pathways sending signals back out to the muscles.
Right, so you can connect what you're seeing to what's actually happening inside.
Exactly.
It's so cool. This has been such a great deep dive. Really appreciate you breaking all of this down for us.
It's been my pleasure.
I know this is just the beginning, though. There's so much more to learn about the nervous system.
There is. But hopefully this has given everyone a good foundation.
A good starting point.
Yeah. And just remember, never stop being curious, never stop asking questions, never stop learning.
Because the more we learn, the better we can care for our patients.
Absolutely. From Vet Neurojar, keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.